More news on the go. Airports Company South Africa is giving an update on their state of preparedness ahead of the peak season. In fact, ACSA CEO Mpumi Mpofu has just begun, or at least has been briefing or leading that briefing. Let's listen to it.
For aviation services, and very simply the relationship between urban and rural population also gives us very clear pointers for air traffic demand. And that would relate to the bigger cities with high population growth having a greater demand, and then our smaller airports in more rural settings also impacted by that. Now, air transport generally is very closely related to economic development in our space and also geographical location. Here we give you a very clear sense of the yearly trips per capita and where we are as South Africa compared to other countries. A very clear indication, we are at 0.3 trips per capita, and in a sense the projection is that we will be at 0.7 trips per capita by 2043. That gives you a sense of the growth projection that actually is not as robust as we would like it to be, and it gives you a sense very clearly that we in 2043 would have only seen a growth of about 0.4% of those trips per capita. That's the effective growth of the industry calculated on per capita basis, and that gives you a very better sense. This picture shows the overall projected forecasts over the period and the growth of aviation over the period. What we see is a very clear dip, and I'm sure by now if you've come to our press conferences you are used to the 2020 dip that we talk about and that impact of COVID that's illustrated by that drop to 3.6 billion. That's very clearly indicated, and this is a global level, but what it does show is a trend line of a incline in growth of the industry that is steady, that looks quite slow, but is on an upward trajectory. And that's very important because once you see that growth, you'll be able to judge our own performance at Airports Company South Africa on the basis of whether we are in line with that global trend or we are below it. And it's very important because as airports, we contribute towards the constitution of these global figures. And we are quite a significant airport network, the largest in Africa, the best in Africa, but also a major contributor to the global one. And so by definition, our alignment to global trends and performance is how you judge us, and we should be able to determine that on that basis. So what we do see is everybody coming out of 2020 figures and returning back to 2019, around about 25, 26, and all of us quite happy that we are at ACSA. We're at 88% of that recovery, and by definition we are on course with the rest of the world. That is then the ACSA network total estimated passenger by year 2042, and the point that we're illustrating is very clearly that it's exactly like that trend line that you saw at the global level, and our performance will take us particularly in 2024 from 38 million to 41 million in 2025, rising up to 71 million in 2042. And it's a steady one, it's an increasing one. Unless we have another COVID or another dip or something else, but generally on our plans, on the capacity that we develop, on the infrastructure that we basically invest in, we are feeding that trend line and ensuring that we keep up with the requirements and the demand that we know. There may be other factors that impact on our trend line, and those factors may sometimes be what happens in the airline industry that we're not entirely in control of. We may lose an airline, we may have a dip, but if I just explain the issue of an airline, colleagues, it really has a short-term impact, and I'm sure you've seen it by now. I think originally, before we experienced this in South Africa, we would think if we lose an airline, it means the air transport services will decline. But our experience has been quite the opposite. It does, but a very short while, because what happens very speedily is the airlines then deploy more aircraft and they cover that gap quite easily. So having a mixed particularly domestic network that constitutes many airlines, helps us to buffer, because we don't have one airline which may collapse and create a calamity, but we actually have many, and they take up that space quite easily. In about a week or two, we normally see our figures going back to normal as a result of that. There are a number of other issues, though, that are impacting on the environment, and particularly the issue of decarbonization of the aviation sector. And in that particular space here, we just give you a sense of the growth of sustainable aviation fuels that are starting to impact on the environment and become quite an important determinant factor in relation to fleet efficiency, but also in relation to a decarbonized future. We subscribe to the Airports Council International towards zero emissions in 2050, and we monitor our own performance against that. At this point, about 4 of our airports are already accredited at what is called level 2 in the decarbonization and accreditation program, and we are putting more of our airports into the stream so that we operate in the very sensible way of mitigating climate change, but also, more importantly, reducing our carbon footprint in this way, but also contributing to the overall reduction in the South African context. This particular slide talks to commercial aircraft. I indicated on the supply chain there's issues related to just a shortage of aircraft across the network and availability of fleet. And this is also an indication of a backlog that's been created in the manufacturing space, and therefore quite a constrained environment in air aviation services, particularly delivered by airlines. And one of the impact it does have is an impact on affordability of airlines. So they are working with less fleet than they would like, and by definition that has an impact on the ticket pricing as well, and just their whole financial model. So again, earlier I spoke to jet fuel pricing, which is one issue impacted by wars and fuel costs, even though they come down sometimes, but generally they are at an all-time high given where we are in the globe. Airlines speak today of up to 30% of their bottom line coming from just the fuel costs. That's unprecedented, because historically this figure was double-digit, 10 to 15 or thereabouts. But we've lived with this 30% effect for quite some time. This phenomenon of shortage of fleet is now a new one, and it's come through after COVID. And what is the real issue there? There are not many manufacturing companies. We have Boeing, we have Airbus, we have Embraer, and happily in South Africa we're one of the areas where Embraer is to be seen. For the uninitiated, Embraer aircrafts are the ones Airlink has, the smaller aircraft, and they're very useful for regional trips, smaller, shorter distances. And as such, all of them have constraints around supply. The industry in manufacturing cannot produce enough. They've got extensive backlogs. Everybody's waiting for new aircrafts. And I'm not advertising them, but Ethiopian Airlines has just received a few aircrafts to complete its 100 aircraft fleet. They've got an order that's been outstanding for a few years for another 50. Outstanding for a few years. And that gives you a sense of really the constraint that the airlines are facing in this respect. So what we look at here is just basically the backlogs, where they've not delivered, and the orders that they have. And the orders are almost equivalent to the deliveries that they are able to do, both at Boeing in 2024 with 258 deliveries, but also 250 gross orders that have just not been delivered. That gives you a sense of that constraint. We look at this because it's important to us, it's a main driver. It also tells us when we've given opportunity for airlines
Live visuals there coming from Airports Company South Africa. Speaking, there's the CEO, Mpumi Mpofu, who is outlining, I think, just important context around the performance of the industry over the past couple of perhaps months, even longer than that, at least taking us back to COVID-19 times. Essentially, there's a steady growth in the industry. They reckon that's going to continue for the next couple of years. What I found is quite interesting is an admittance there that there is a shortage of aircraft and fleet, which does affect pricing. If you've tried to go to Cape Town or Durban from Johannesburg recently, you'll know what I mean. It might be sometimes be easier to fly outside the country, we're told. But anyway, we're told this is because there is a lack of manufacturers who are actually feeding this aircraft into the industry. There's also talk there about the cost of jet fuel. There's been a lot of conversation in the past few weeks about that. It's being affected by the wars in the world, and no surprises about that, given, of course, that even the petrol price for ordinary motorists has been impacted by these conflicts. We're still waiting for that update around what we saw at OR Tambo International Airport this week. As soon as they get to that part of the update, we'll try to bring it to you.